Welcome to a conversation on the business case for circularity in the built environment. My name is Christina Raab, and I'm the Vice President Strategy and Development at the Cradle to Cradle Products Innovation Institute. We are a global nonprofit organization dedicated to powering innovation for the circular economy through materials and products that have a positive impact on people and planet. I have the great pleasure today to speak to Owen Zachariasse, Director of Workplace Strategy at JLL Netherlands, a world leader in real estate services. Welcome, Owen, and thank you for being with us today.
Good morning, Christina. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
The World Green Building Council estimates that the building and construction sector accounts for 39% of global carbon emissions. In your view, Owen, how does the adoption of a circular approach to design and construction position the sector to rapidly begin reversing this trajectory?
Right. So first and foremost, indeed, it's roughly around 39 to 40% of the carbon emissions are being emitted from the built environment sector. So we definitely have quite a bit of work to do. I like to view that as an opportunity, not necessarily as a huge problem. It is a problem, but it's an opportunity for us to have a major impact in the future resilience of our environment. And so when we're looking at circular solutions, we're looking at not only the design, but we're looking at the design, we're looking at the use, we're looking at the next uses of all these different buildings, assets, as we call them, or also the components that go into them. We should really be looking at buildings as an accumulation of a bunch of different raw materials, resources that go into building materials to create these structures. So a circular approach really is looking at, from the inner loops perspective, how can we continue to keep the materials in positive flows? So the best thing that we can do is to either keep them at the equal level of quality or even do what we call upcycling, which is to increase the quality. Think of, for an example of that, think of steel. If you could increase the purity of the steel content, then that would be a form of upcycling. And then we're also not only looking at the inner loops of the different reuses of the components and building itself, but we're also looking at what happens when that building no longer serves a purpose in our communities, and how can we deconstruct, salvage as much as possible, and move those, really valuable resources onto different structures. So what we also know is that much of the carbon emissions really is broken down to what we call embodied carbon. That's also the carbon that's embedded within all of those different materials going into buildings. And that's in large part a component of the production of these materials, also the transportation of these materials. So what we also look at in circularity is, how are we going to power our economies? How are we going to power our systems? And the clear preference is for clean, renewable energy. And so if we can then start infusing clean, renewable energy into the production process, then we can really take a positive leap in the carbon emissions of the embodied carbon of these buildings. So to wrap a bow around all of what I just said, the circular economy helps us to take a look at the production process. How do we minimize and eliminate the embodied carbon in that process? And once these materials go into structures, how do we then actually make sure that those structures are being used as long and effectively as possible? When they no longer serve a purpose, how do we make sure that all of those materials are either going back into our into our built environment, or where possible, safely returning to the natural world through biodegradation?
And taking up the theme of circular economy, so much of the focus on circular economy within the building sector has historically centered on circular design, from early stage design intervention to retrofits. And now the conversation has advanced to encompass finance and investment, as the sector leaders begin also to recognize the potential economic benefits of the circular model. Owen, you have first-hand experience with this. In 2012, you spearheaded the groundbreaking Park 2020 project in Amsterdam, the world's first cradle-to-cradle optimized working environment and the world's largest assembly of cradle-to-cradle certified materials in a real estate development. And this project has really become a model for how to integrate cradle-to-cradle principles and certified materials and the role they play in transforming human health, well-being and productivity, as well as environmental health. You're now continuing this leadership at JLL. And based on your experience at the front line of driving circular buildings and development, how will circular economy thinking and the application of circular principles lead better economic performance in the building and construction sector?
So Park 2020 was a great project to be involved in and be a part of the team. It was a massive team that goes into building an entire office park there. So I was one small piece of the pie. And it was a fantastic learning experience. And we see that now continuing forward in JLL. I'm working more on the interior side. And so let me kind of start there first at what we're doing there. Is that when you start taking a look at how much of what we call, let's say, the stuff that will go into our buildings. And you take a look at a building, you have the site, so that's the land. You have the core and shell, which is pretty much the center part of the building. Many times built in concrete, although what's great now is we're starting to see more timber constructions, cross-laminated timber structures for the core. And then you have the shell, which is actually then the skin of the building, the facade, but what we see on the outside of the building. But then you have the interiors, and you have things like the HVAC systems, the sprinklers, all of those mechanical installations, electrical installations. Then you have, let's say, movable walls and all of the furniture, carpet tiles, all of the stuff that comes into the building. And it increases exponentially when you start going towards that stuff component. So focusing it on workplaces and on the interiors enables us to really engage with our clients and customers to, number one, help them to understand what the impacts of the interiors is, not only on their balance sheet, but also on the environment. I think that the two really go hand in hand. And when you can find a solution that's quite elegant, very easy to explain and easy to understand, that shows that indeed there's an economic benefit to looking at actually circular materials, then you really have people's attention. So that's part and parcel to a very good service offering. And what we end up seeing now is, early days in the circular economy, everyone identified very early on the decoupling of growth from resource consumption. Walter Stahl was one of the earlier writers about this. And really talks very much about how can we actually then facilitate growth without having to actually deplete all of the resources. And one of the things that came up and things that were carried on by people like Michael Braungart and William McDonough were also how can we actually then look at using products and materials instead of actually having to buy and own them. So that's typically what we call products as a service. And that products as a service in terms of interiors can have quite some benefits. So that's what we're doing now in terms of JLL in our workplace strategies for sustainability and circularity. And we also have quite a number of strategies of how we can help, really give beautiful products a second use in the interiors as well. One of our JLL offices in Manchester is also another really great example of how that's taking place. And so I advise people to go check that out too and see what was being done over at that JLL Manchester office. Really very exciting. Indeed, better economic performance. One things that you see in terms of buildings and property as a whole is that we cannot sidestep the fact that property now is an investment vehicle, and much of the driver is what's taking place through large institutional investors. Think about the pension funds, people that are managing all of the money from dentists or you name it, teachers. But you also have some private investment companies that are quite large and have a lot of influence in the industry. And what we're actually seeing is that they are really calling for much more of what we call resilient property. And for them, resilient property is also a way that the risk can be better mitigated from investment. So one thing at we looked at in Park 2020. And I think that looking at a number, and there's a number of great examples globally on cradle to cradle and circular buildings, not just Park 2020, but in speaking with my colleagues, what we've all really kind of agreed upon is that quality is really what we're talking about. What we would always look at, and I believe that this is a nice approach, at least one I appreciate, is that we're about producing quality, and things like the cradle to cradle certification and verification system is really almost like a quality control process and helping us to enable the right amount of quality for the right price to be produced. And that quality then carries with it a different price point. So, through good development tactics and making sure to focus on high quality products and buildings, not the cheapest products and buildings, because in there is then the embedded cost to society, which is oftentimes greater than the cost of the product. So, that's really kind of how the approach that we had for economic performance. Focus on the quality and make sure that we can talk about decoupling resource consumption from production and from utilization.
I know when you mentioned resilience, I think it's a very important word in the current times. So also 2020 marked the beginning of what the United Nations called a decade of action. So really an urgent opportunity to reduce our carbon impact, to protect the climate. And now incentives for green buildings, carbon reductions and renewable energy are also playing a central role in the post-pandemic economic recovery for many countries. And so there's an even greater runway of opportunity for owners, for investors and developers to adopt a circular model. In your view, what actions need to occur to implement a circular model and to actually bring the topic of circularity to scale?
Yeah. Well, a decade of impact, it couldn't have come quick enough. That's my first reaction to this point. And I hope that we have a very impactful decade, a purpose-driven decade ahead of us in terms of as business people. And let me then start there by, that's a big question, first and foremost. And let me first say that, if there was a silver bullet to all of this, then we would have found it by now. So, it has to be a number of different actions by different players that are all really kind of focusing. And so maybe that's the first thing that we need is really focus. We need focus, and we need to be really looking at science and trusting the research that is out there. That's imperative for us to be able to take progressive steps forward, is to understand that really these science-based targets are the way to go. And to trust those people that have made entire careers for creating good science, to help equip people like me, practitioners, with information to help make decisions on where to go. So that's number one. And so in terms of what are some of the steps that are really needed to pull this off the ground, again, I would say that because there's no single silver bullet, it's about collaboration. And I think that you hear a lot of people talking about that. So I'm excited to see that conversation persists, that we all know that we can't do this on our own. And one of the more exciting kinds of collaboration that I would see would be, of course, public-private partnership, because we have to have a combined push-pull in our world to take these steps forward. So really kind of that collaboration between really a good, very well thought through regulation that evens the playing field and incentivizes people to make the right decisions and do the right thing for the future of our societies and planet and the people as well on our planet. We cannot forget about them. They're very important. And at the same time, then really that innovative spirit and characteristic from industry. I see that we do a number of PPPs or public-private partnerships in things like infrastructure projects. These are things that we already know how to do. So I would be quite excited to see a lot more public-private partnerships on more initial and early stage innovation. I would start to say the more that government can become involved in helping innovations in things like battery technology, storage of renewable energies, different ways for carbon offset, carbon capture, these types of solutions, any type of innovative solution that you can really think that's for the progressive good, I'm all about. And when it comes to scale, there's quite a number of ways to scale, but I would like to then go back to the production process and start to say that, scaling production of great, healthy products that promote a resilient economy, then that would be in a resilient built environment, then that would be really helpful. So I would really look again then at the clean renewable energies of how can we more efficiently inject clean renewable energies with zero carbon emissions into the production processes, and how can we then also really look at the advancements in some manufacturing techniques and machine technologies.
Coming back to the material level, so safe, circular, and responsible materials are really the driving currency of a successful circular economy model in any sector. However, in the built environment, the procurement and the use of such materials is literally the foundation of this model. And in addition to the many benefits, of course, to health, to well-being, to the environment, how do safe and circular materials, in particular those that are third-party verified, help owners and investors recapture lost value, and drive in that also greater residual value of buildings?
One is that also, I would say that the purchasing department and tendering procedures is indeed a way that you can really promote great behavior. It's also a way where you see some of the really poorest behavior exist. It's a place that really can be make or break for a number of projects. So, what I would really advocate in the tendering procedure is to really stick hard to your budget. No one would advocate that you should blow your budget up or outspend your budget. That's not good, sound behavior. So, but we should be really looking to spend the entire budget, be very open and transparent in those tendering procedures, and making sure that we're maximizing the budgets and make sure that you're getting the highest quality possible. And that's where we come into these third-party verified certifications like Cradle to Cradle, where it helps us to confidently make decisions about the quality characteristics of what we're purchasing. So in that respect, then on the front end, you have access to more information and data. And as long as that information is transparent, as long as it's reliable, as long as it's up to date, then, and as long as it can be maintained, because I think that that's also an area we have to really be very critical on ourselves in the built environment, is that, structures, this is a long-term product. This is not, an iPhone that people want to replace every few years. This is a building that stands here for 30, 50, 70 years. So being able to maintain and update the product data all over those times enables us to come out the other end with a very good sheet of, okay, this is what's in my building and this is how I can value it on the fair market right now if you were to take it apart. Essentially, you're putting a building together. You're enabling that it's deconstructed, not demolished with dynamite and big wrecking balls, but that it can be deconstructed, that the resources can be properly split, and that they can actually then hold a value that can then be sold. So instead of paying demolition costs at the end of a project's use period, we're actually then monetizing what we have left over. And then that's a case that can be negotiated and created by the owner of the building and whoever wants to do whatever next with that piece of land or that building.
Great. And I would like to take up the theme of data, because we have, of course, the forthcoming Cradle to Cradle certified version 4. And this will require also a publication of a circularity data report for materials. And the report will also include data to support the cycling of materials and informs the end user how to do so. So how, in your view, could you speak a little bit more how the availability of such transparent data and information could bring the concept of building of materials banks more into practice?
Yeah, I'm really excited about this. I think this is one of the great additions in version 4 of the Cradle to Cradle certification standard. So, for us to be able to have open, reliable, transparent data, and also increase knowledge sharing across the industry, it helps to level the playing field, right? Because it provides everybody with this access to the same type of information. So number one, I think that it's really critical that we have access to this information. I think it's very I think it's great that the certification standard is not only saying, okay, we want you to produce in a certain way and design your products in a certain way, but we also need you to embed, what's in that and be able to make that readily available to the community. Also, I think that you can take that down a number of streets, as I just alluded to. You could also use this to really forward progress in trade associations or groups of companies getting together and trying to say, how can we collectively take progressive steps forward. Architects and designers can get together and start to say, how can we really, start to have good, embed better practices and use this data to actually make design decisions, which is really exciting, I think. And the educational level, data then can also then, become into the classrooms and help our students understand that it's, our design and our creative eye and our creative mind really needs to be supported by data and information to help us confidently communicate what our structures are all about. So I think it's quite exciting that's a piece. And I think it's important also for the community that's taking up this data and starting to work with this data to really feed back also into, the cradle to cradle certification community that's creating these standards and help them to understand how improvements to effectiveness, how the effectiveness of the data can be used. And, making it all public, because we can't protect and be in this protectionism mode and try and create barriers to access to information for people, because that's not going to be then a decade of impact. If we're keep up those barriers and keep building walls between us, practitioners, then we're going to remain stuck.
Let's briefly speak about the valuation topic. I think it's a very important topic for owners, developers, investors, of course. And it's also central to the return of investment conversation around safe and circular materials. So how can a standard like a cradle-to-cradle certified operate as an enabling mechanism for valuation?
Right? Information is really kind of what helps us to understand what the value of something is. So the better the information, the more reliable the information, the more confident and targeted we can value anything. So the cradle-to-cradle certification standard, by increasing this, access to data and reporting, positive reporting on all the materials, should help us to really enhance that valuation. At least take a good step forward in that. I would also say that, again, like quality control, as we spoke to earlier, is being able to understand what goes into the cradle-to-cradle certification standard, that we know what kind of quality checks there are that go into to certifying a product at various levels. And these are things like removing harmful toxic substances, because we don't want those things to be cycled back through our industrial production process. They have no place in our buildings. They have no place in our communities. So being able to actually then look at, at least one set of products that you would choose, we can, with a trustworthy third-party verification standard, we can actually identify that these are not only free of these harmful substances, but that we can also readily identify what is in there. So I think that in that respect, then, that enables us to really start looking at how the value of these materials, because they should, until now, have not really received a fair shake in the valuation process. Of course, location, of course, market dynamics and rental agreements are and rental prices are impacting and influencing the value of assets, along with many other inputs to the valuation process. But the building materials is one that, to this point, has not really been thought of, and that has a huge part of quality of the building, not only today but in its future use and its next use. Thinking of cradle to cradle and circular economy design, which is looking for increasing flexibility and agility within structures, means that buildings can be very, very easily reconfigured to be serving one function today and a second function tomorrow. So in that respect, then that should also, that flexibility and agility to meet market requirements and market demands should also then be valued into the whole process as well.
Great. Let's conclude by looking into the future and looking ahead across this decade of action or this decade of impact. So, Owen, what is your vision for the building and construction sector by 2030, and which main opportunities do you foresee around sustainability and circularity?
Yeah, unfortunately, I just moved houses and I left my crystal ball back at the old house. But let me say what I would like to hear. I would say that my hope is really that we have much more consensus from a government and regulatory perspective on what we need to move forward. And I hope that's sooner rather than later. I'm really looking at the energy. I think emissions and energy really kind of to power our economies is critical. So I would really hope to, at the end of the decade, to be, standing with a lot of people giving a standing ovation to the energy sector for making the transformation towards, clean energy. I'd like to see the regulatory and government sectors also really leveling the playing field and making sure that we are properly incentivizing through policy, and also, holding those accountable for doing the wrong thing as well. So a bit more of that balance between, what are we subsidizing and what is being paid for. I would take a look at I would really like to see us have a lot more sophistication in the production processes and new innovative techniques for creating built environment materials. I'd like to see us actually also become much more sophisticated in what we call urban mining, of how we can actually really tackle the current built environment. And to close, I'd really like to see, and it's my expectation that it will also be the case, is the massive acceleration of the amount of products that are receiving cradle-to-cradle certification. Because, for practitioners like myself, that's really important, because, I would be lying to all of you watching this video and this interview if I said I would had a degree in being able to look at chemistry for these materials. So I rely heavily, as do many of my colleagues, on those great people creating the cradle-to-cradle certification standard, and all those great people in the manufacturing business of building materials to really do the right thing and to increase the availability of choice for us to be able to provide to our clients and customers. And I'll tell you, our clients and customers are asking about them more and more every day. They're continually coming to us saying, what kind of solutions are out there? They're keenly aware of the impacts of toxicity on their office spaces, and businesses are really noticing. And so we see that on a regular basis, the question for help me to create not just a brand new dynamic and experience-driven office that helps us to meet the challenges of today, but also do so in a way that promotes safe, healthy environments that contribute to a positive well-being of our people. So I would close off by saying, at the end of the decade time, I would like to see the hockey stick, not just in population and not just in carbon emissions, but also in cradle-to-cradle certified materials on the market.
Thank you, Owen, for this very ambitious vision. And we have a lot to do there. I think both of our organizations, of course, very, very motivated.